Hello History 2051 class, this is Joel June, your instructor, and this is going to be our first review video looking at chapters 7 and 8. And before we get going, I just want to thank all of you for sticking with us here through all these transitions, for being adaptive and flexible. I know it has not been easy, but I know we're all doing our best to get through this, and hopefully this is going to be a good way to sort of close that feedback loop and at least give you a taste of some of what we would have been covering and talking about and discussing in our class had I been able to come back and resume in-person instruction. So basically how this is going to work is I am going to be going through all of the reflection questions that you answered. I'll be going through the document activity that you responded to and sort of going over what some of your responses and your answers were, what I saw a lot of in the class, adding in some of my own ideas and perspectives, and going from there. So not quite the discussions that we would have had in class, but at least hopefully a close proximity. Also, I'm going to apologize if you hear any little kids in the background as I'm recording this. Obviously, we are quarantining like everyone else, so it is just my wife and myself and our kids, and I am recording this in as quiet of a place as I can find, but still the little ones are around. So if you hear any crying or yelling or so forth in the background, I just want to ask your forgiveness for that, as of course we were all sort of operating in extenuating circumstances here. All right, well, let's go ahead and get into it. Of course, these two chapters focus very heavily on the build-up to the Second World War and sort of the course that the Second World War took. And of course, in a class about conflict and crisis, this was one of sort of the largest of the 20th century. So very much sort of a focal point of our class here. So we're going to go ahead and I'll start by going over the first question. And certainly you can't talk about the Second World War really without focusing and starting with Nazi Germany, how it came to be, how an individual like Adolf Hitler came to have such a large and prominent role on sort of the world scale, and ultimately how that really was the instigating factor for the outbreak of what we do consider the Second World War. So looking at our first reflection question here, how and why were Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party able to rise to power in Germany? And what about the Nazi Party appealed to so many Germans? So first and foremost, to really, I'd say, understand the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party, you have to understand a couple of things. And these are things that a lot of people brought up in your responses to this question. The first of all was the sort of extreme resentment over the Treaty of Versailles from the First World War. This is really one of the reasons why a lot of people do consider the First World War and the Second World War part of the same conflict, because so much that happens in this interwar period between sort of the hot spots of this conflict are very much tied together, and that without sort of the Treaty of Versailles and the treatment of Germany in that treaty, without that, it was very hard to imagine that what in the beginning was very much sort of a fringe political group like the Nazi Party would have been able to become as powerful as they were, and ultimately would be able to have seized power in the manner in which they did. So very much the people of Germany, sort of the average person on the street, all of them very much resented the Treaty of Versailles. The fact that Germany had been saddled with all of the blame essentially for the First World War, even though if you think back to that section, it was sort of a lot more sort of amalgamous, I would say, in nature. How certainly it wasn't simply Germany declaring war on all these other countries, that there were the Austro-Hungarians were involved in it, the Russians were involved in it, and, you know, it takes two to tango, if you want to think of it that way. And the Germans said there were plenty of other people who you can sort of point the finger to, and of course their main allies, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, had essentially been dismantled by the end of the First World War, which meant that the only real sort of political entity left to take the blame for this was going to be Germany. So some of the things that they felt were very unfair was the fact that there were these huge reparation payments that they were supposed to be paying back essentially to France and Great Britain, and that this was supposed to sort of pay those countries back for the economic downturns they had suffered through the war periods, the expense of the war, the loss of life, and so forth that they had incurred. And really, with Germany being just as bad off, if not worse so, than those other countries at the end of the war, there's very little chance that Germany was going to have a chance to pay those back, and certainly it was going to be very difficult for them to pay back any of those reparations while sort of rebuilding their own country. So while there was certainly a period of sort of a depression and a rebuilding period in Europe, it was much worse in Germany, as there was lots of inflation. Their economy was hit very hard, and of course they were trying to essentially sort of rebuild a new political system at the same point in time that was always going to be hampered by sort of the treaty that was in place. Another big thing that was very aggravating to the German people was that the country of Germany was split up into multiple pieces and parts sort of at the end of this. Portions of Germany were given to Poland, portions of Germany were given to Czechoslovakia, a new country that was formed. Portions of it were still in German hands, but were sort of being occupied by France. So Germany was sort of being sliced up all across the board. And there was this real sense that the people within Germany wanted sort of all the German-speaking people in these other countries around them to be reunified into one country once again. They thought this sort of fracturing of the country was imposed upon them, and it was this concept of what they called a Greater Germany that they wanted to get back together. Sort of all these German-speaking locations and peoples that had once been part of Germany prior to the First World War, they wanted to bring back together again. And finally, just sort of other things that they felt were put in place to make it sure that they were never going to be able to be sort of a strong, powerful country again, limit on their armed forces, for example, a sort of determination of the kind of things that they could produce, making sure they weren't going to be producing armaments or things that they could use for war. All of these were aspects of the treaty that the German people found very, very distasteful and wanted to get rid of. And one of the big things that Hitler and the Nazi Party promised was that they were essentially going to reverse the Treaty of Versailles, that they were going to pretty much scrap the treaty and find ways to sort of overturn and to sort of get back what they had felt sort of been unfairly imposed upon them or taken from them. All of this was only exacerbated by the coming of the Great Depression in the late 1920s. The fact that a lot of the reparations payments that Germany was able to make was essentially being fueled by the United States, essentially sort of lending them money that they were then able to repay to Britain, as well as France. And that also just sort of direct aid from the United States to those countries, trade between the United States and those countries. A lot of the rebuilding of Europe was based upon the United States in one way, shape, or another. Suddenly, with the Great Depression, you have sort of that's what had been the strongest economy coming out of the First World War in the United States now taking a huge sort of economic hit. A lot of their banks are closing. We all know sort of about how the stock market was hit very heavily. And in response to this, what the United States government ends up doing is essentially creating protectionist economic policies, so making it harder for foreign countries to trade with them, harder for themselves to trade with foreign countries, and a lot of these foreign countries end up having their own tariffs that they put into place, their own sort of protectionist policies, which in looking back at it was absolutely the wrong thing for all of them to be doing, which essentially said that in order for any country to sort of pull itself out of the Great Depression, they'd have to do it by themselves. They couldn't use any sort of external global economic profitability in order to sort of help solve this economic crisis. And once you cut that off, it just sort of deepened the depression for all of these countries. So of course that meant that Germany, because they are already sort of hard hit by all this, now the fact that sort of any sort of extra economic support potentially from the United States or any other country really was going to be completely cut off, they were once more going to be on their own. And increasingly there was a feeling that the Weimar Republic, the sort of German government that had been established after the First World War, was not capable of handling the situation, that there was a lot of infighting, there was a lot of jealousy and competition between various factions, and ultimately the Germans felt like their needs were not being met by the sort of government that was in place. Also, not just in Germany, but really across Europe at this point in time, there was a lot of competition between the way I'll phrase it is socialist factions and conservative factions within various governments. You see this in France following the First World War. You see this in Germany following the First World War. You see it in Great Britain following the First World War. That sort of the rise of the Soviet Union, the fact that that had sort of been a successful communist revolution, and of course communism very similar to socialism, although certainly not the same thing as communism was much more tied in with authoritarianism, that socialists in all these countries sort of had gotten a boost from that. And there had been sort of a period in the 1920s of sort of an increased power, increased communication between these various socialist factions in these countries. And in a lot of these countries, you saw sort of the conservative forces in those countries pushing back, trying to make sure that the socialists were not going to be able to get a foothold or get a lot of power or support within their individual governments. I phrase it in the sense of conservatism rather than capitalism, because a lot of times during this time period, even if there were capitalist forces involved within these countries, quite typically they were going to be allied with more previous versions of sort of conservatism, whether it was conservative kind of monarchy type governments, whether it would be sort of traditional sort of aristocracies or elite classes that would relying upon now sort of capitalism in business and industry in order to sort of maintain their power, religious organizations and so forth. There were, in a lot of these countries, also parties that were more focused on sort of middle of the road, more sort of liberal but not necessarily socialist political elements in parties. But typically what you see end up happening, you see this happening in Italy in their rise of fascism, you see this happening in Germany, is that sort of the conservative forces, their fear of socialism, and primarily the fact that socialism in a democratic setting seemed to be doing very well and getting a lot of support. A lot of times these conservative governments end up turning increasingly towards undermining the democratic process because they didn't feel like they were winning in that realm, and increasingly they're going to start turning more and more and more towards various forms of autocracy or dictatorships in order to prevent those factions within their country from gaining power. So one of the ironic things in the case of Germany is that actually sort of the undermining of the democratic process and sort of the destruction of democracy comes before the Nazis actually take power. As you remember, there was sort of that power sharing agreement between Papen and Hindenburg, and sort of the political maneuvering that they were trying to do to make sure that sort of their traditional conservative factions were going to be maintaining power. And in that, they sort of entered into a power-sharing agreement with Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, which up until that point in time really had been sort of much more of a fringe party. Certainly in response to the Great Depression, they saw their popularity and their numbers grow, but really the Nazi Party never even had a majority within the German government before the time period where essentially those other forces pretty much hand Adolf Hitler pretty much uncontrolled power. They very much mistakenly thought that they could sort of maintain his power and control his power and profit themselves, and didn't realize just sort of how quickly Adolf Hitler and his factions were going to be able to gain control of the country, gain control of popular support within the country, and really become a whole nother animal than they had originally anticipated. So functionally, politically, really that is how Germany is able to rise to power. We already went into a little bit about why the Nazi Party was so appealing to the various Germans. We talked about how unpopular the Treaty of Versailles was and how they had been very much one of these strong voices of trying to redress those grievances. Another thing is really just sort of this idea of nationalism. We talked a lot about it in our introduction class. Obviously, I haven't been around for all the lectures, but we've talked about in various forms how nationalism had grown throughout the world, really, in the 20th century. And certainly Germany was no exception. I think we focused a lot on the role that nationalism played in the build-up to the First World War, of course, how all these European countries really felt that they had sort of this national superiority amongst everyone else, and were really sort of in the lead-up to the First World War more or less itching for a fight, right? All these great powers wanted to sort of prove that they were going to be the greatest nation. And really, that sentiment never really dies out. Certainly, some countries learned the lesson of the First World War, that might not necessarily be a beneficial or healthy thing for a country to have that sort of extreme nationalism going on. Certainly Great Britain and France check that to a certain degree. I'm not saying it's completely obliterated in those countries, but certainly they don't want that idea of nationalism getting to the point where it's going to be driving their countries into armed military conflicts anymore. Germany doesn't necessarily learn that lesson, particularly because they once more felt, and this is going to be something that is articulated by Hitler and the Nazi parties, that they hadn't actually lost the war. They were still this great nation, and that for some reason, whether it was sort of internal sabotage, of course this is where he's going to try to find these scapegoats, or whether it was sort of external sabotage, that Germany and the German people essentially had been sort of robbed of a victory in the First World War. Of course, this was very much revisionist history. Germany had pretty much gotten themselves into an unwinnable war in the First World War. The fact that they had far fewer people and troops on their side, the fact that they were surrounded essentially by enemies, very much placed them in a unwinnable context, particularly when the war grinds down in the First World War to sort of that stalemate, trench war type of conflict. So what you see end up happening then is that the argument essentially that Hitler makes is that no, Germany didn't lose the First World War. The people of Germany are still this fantastic, great people. Of course, he brings, and we'll be talking about this in a minute, really doubles down on that idea of scientific racism, of eugenics, of social Darwinism. Pretty much argues not only are the Germans sort of this great people who didn't lose the First World? No, we're the best people, right? We're the master race, if you want to think of that term. That comes in during this time period. And to a lot of Germans, that's something that they wanted to hear. You know, they didn't want to accept the fact that they had, in their country, had essentially sort of made these mistakes getting into the First War, that they were not able to be victorious in the First War, and very much wanted to feel like they had, in some way or shape or form, been betrayed, that it wasn't their fault, that they were still this great country, and essentially that's what Hitler and the Nazi Party promised. You know, not to put too fine a point on it, but they promised to make Germany great again, and that's what they set out to do, and to a lot of Germans, that's exactly what they wanted to hear. So once Hitler and the Nazi Party are able to essentially gain power through the process we talked about previously, they're able to get a large amount of public support because of sort of the hyper-nationalism that they embody, because of their vehement efforts to overturn the treaty, and so forth. So I thought a lot of that was brought up in your answers in various ways or points to various degrees. But yes, I thought a lot of people did a fantastic job answering number one here. I think this is a good time to switch over and talk a little bit about our primary sources. The primary source very much ties in to this idea of the rise of the Nazi Party. And looking at the Nazi Party platform, I think is pretty important. I mean, one of the questions that you often hear about this time period is, how could this happen, right? How could a country like Nazi Germany actually come to power? How could some people actually follow someone like Adolf Hitler, who, looking back at it, you sort of realize all the flaws and how dangerous it was, and certainly we know the very catastrophic violence and death and hatred which came from this. So how does something like that get started? And I think that's why looking at something like the creation of the Nazi Party platform here, which dates from the late 20s, I believe it was 1928, is so important. Because it shows you that in the first articulations of what the Nazis are trying to do isn't the ultimate end that you get to, right? They didn't start by essentially saying, we're going to, declare war on all these other countries in Europe, and we're going to be massacring people in our country who don't agree with us. We're going to be having these stormtroopers marching in our streets, rooting out anyone who's disloyal. None of that is articulated in this very early form. What is here, though, are very, I would say, scary and troubling signs that eventually are going to be leading to all those things that I just mentioned. But it's important to note that fascism doesn't necessarily start with what we oftentimes think of it as being, as those sort of scenes of, all the stormtroopers marching by, Hitler giving his Nazi salute, right? That it starts a lot more subtly and a lot more dangerously, because it starts with things that are going to be appealing to a lot of people, right? And that's really why I think it's important to look at a document like the Nazi Party platform, because you can start to see how these ideas start creeping into political parties start creeping into a country's sort of psyche and so forth without realizing necessarily how dangerous and the ultimate end results that these types of ideas can have. So question number one, what were the main goals and aims of the Nazi parties presented in this document? First of all, if you'll notice, there's a lot of work on defining citizenship, right? Who is a citizen? Who constitutes a citizen? Of course, this idea of citizenship comes very much back down to the concept of nationalism, right? It comes down to things like language, like history, to a certain degree comes down to religion, even though they say it doesn't come down to religion. Certainly the fact that they are categorizing anyone who is Jewish, which is a religion, not a race, trying to categorize them as being non-citizens or non-Germans, very articulately, clearly defines who is a citizen. Most of the rest of the document then goes on to explain how great things are going to be for citizens, so all the benefits that citizens are going to be reaping and appealing, while at the same point in time essentially putting restrictions and sort of promising bad things for those who are not defined as citizens, right? Those people who they are trying to define as being outside of their nation, outside of their definition of a citizen. So that's really where the sort of the appeal to citizens come, right? Oops, got ahead of myself. For that appeal to citizens comes, right, is that these are all sort of the nice things that we want to do, but only for those people who we identify as being part of who we identify should be part of this nation. Also, you can see evidence in the party platform are attempts to address the treaty grievances from the Treaty of Versailles, right? Trying to rebuild that idea of a greater Germany, trying to rearm themselves, even the idea of trying to get that sort of land for expansion, right? All these are things that should be prohibited to Germany in the treaty, and they're saying, we don't care about that. We're going to go ahead and do that anyway, regardless of the Treaty of Versailles. And either through conflict or diplomacy or war, we're going to find a way to make that happen. You can also see outreach here to both conservatives and socialists, which I think is pretty interesting. The fact that even the Nazi name, right, has a name of socialist in its name, even though ultimately the the Nazi Party is not socialist. They're not socialists at all, right? They are fascists, which is different. They're an autocratic government, which is also different. And the fact that they have a very sort of strong centralized state should not be confused with they are in fact socialists. In fact, they were quite the opposite and the enemies of socialists, and they ultimately sort of ideologically come down very much opposed to once more, sort of that other sort of outgrowth of socialism, communism, right? Essentially, the Soviet Union was seen as Nazi Germany's greatest threat and greatest rival and greatest enemy. But certainly at this point in time, they're trying to reach out and appeal to a broad group of people. So they are going to be throwing in rhetoric and lines and so forth that tries to appeal to people who are both conservatives, primarily people who want a strong military, people who want to sort of return Germany to sort of a nationalistic sense of greatness, as well as socialists as well. So trying to appeal to a lot of people, defining citizenship, addressing those treaty grievances, and also trying to, once more, pin the blame of the loss and the defeat on certain groups of people, once more in particular Jewish individuals, but those are all going to be various aspects that the platform is going to be trying to do. So question 2, what aspects of this platform do you think would have been appealing to average people in Germany? And looking through this, you probably noticed that a lot of it actually doesn't sound that awful, right? Like there's ideas of equality, for example, saying all German people are going to be equal. Well, yeah, on the surface, that sounds great, right? Trying to get rid of some of these class distinctions and so forth. Once more, appealing to some of those ideas of socialism. Idea of old age welfare, also more sort of state-sponsored programs that are going to be benefiting people. The creation of a strong middle class, right, is their idea that they are sort of pushing through this, that they want to be getting out there. So it's more for the majority of Germans is probably going to sound pretty good. Overtures to the freedom of religion. Of course, the fact that they are trying to separate Jewish people out and not including Judaism in this is a very important asterisk to put on this. But on the surface, whether you're Protestant or Catholic or so forth, trying to say these religious divides no longer need to matter. The idea of access to education, right? That seems like it's a really potentially a good deal. So all these things, like on the surface, sound like, yeah, to a lot of average people in Germany, they probably would have been pretty appealing if you just look at the individual pieces. Now, of course, you can't do that. You have to look at the document as a whole and say, yes, these things sound great, but there are all these other sort of warning signs. And I think that gets to number 3 that we were talking about. Who in German society would have been harmed by this platform? Certainly, as we talked about earlier, anyone who is classified as a non-citizen is going to be essentially harmed by this, right? So anyone who is a non-German or doesn't fit into that sort of German ethnic group or German language group is going to be targeted. Of course, we talked about Jewish individuals, how quite often either directly called out in the document, essentially saying no person of Jewish descent can be a citizen of the state, or even, I would say, using more allusions to Jewish people, talking about users and so forth, these sort of code words that were very sort of people try to link up with really what had been a very long tradition of anti-Semitism within Europe, right? None of these ideas were new to the Nazi Party or Germany. Hitler and the Nazis really just wanted to use this hatred that was already there in order to once more sort of scapegoat what had gone wrong in the First World War, what's still going wrong within our society, who is trying to run these governments around us who are hurting us. Well, of course, Jewish people are running them. Once more, completely untrue, but this is the kind of propaganda that the Nazi Party is putting out there and is reinforcing here in their party platform. So that's a big aspect of it. Also, immigrants, right? This idea of anyone who's coming into Germany who is not a German citizen themselves is subject to all the restrictions of not being a citizen, potentially of being kicked out. If you're remember, they talked about essentially going through and kicking all the immigrants out of Germany. So writes more. Any of this idea of anyone who is classified as not being a citizen is always going to be second or third class citizen and always going to be subject to having their rights violated. Essentially, is what this platform is outright saying. Also, anyone who's in the free press is very much going to be harmed by this, right? There's that very sort of stark line in there about how all press is going to be run and regulated by the state, and only sort of those publications that are going to be within sort of their approval are going to be publicized. Only in German, you can't publish in any other language. And that's all going to be very heavily regulated. Also, any advocates of democracy, right? It pretty much says right out there, we want to turn this into an authoritarian government where it's going to be sort of one ruler and sort of the people around him who are going to be having the most voice and the most say and so forth to sort of enforce all these other things, whether the good aspects or the not so good aspects that we are sort of promising in this document. So moving on to question number 4 then, in the end, why do you believe that so many Germans were willing to destroy the representative government and adopt fascism? And a lot of you had really good explanations and ideas about this, and to just sort of summarize, I'd say what a lot of those are and put them together, it's this idea that anger, fear, resentment, sort of everything that had been built up from the loss of the First World War, from the depression that had been setting in, that all this led many Germans to accept that sacrificing of other people's rights is okay and acceptable as long as it benefited themselves. You couldn't look at this document and say, yes, there's some people who are definitely going to be hurt by these ideas and these policies. But the fact that the majority of the population seemed to say, it's okay, these are people, they aren't the majority of Germans, it's okay if we can sacrifice other people's rights so that things are better for me. It seemed like, unfortunately, a large percentage of the population was okay in some way, shape, or form of going along with that. And I'm not saying that it wasn't without a reason, that there were these very real emotions of anger and fear and resentment. And when that happens, obviously, a lot of times it does lead to people saying, I need to look and take care of myself. I can't think of other people. And really, it's that sort of attitude that the Nazi Party was able to use and utilize to their advantage, saying, well, if enough people feel that way, we can use that to gain power and so forth. And I think really that's a lesson that we need to continually look out for, and be cautious of today. Anytime you have an idea of one person saying they have all the answers, I think you need to be very wary and very skeptical. Anytime there's a narrative of, well, the majority is going to benefit because there's just a minority group is making things worse for us, I think you have to be very cautious, right? In times of economic fear or economic change or turmoil, saying once more, the cause of this is certain groups and certain people, and if we can just remove them or eliminate them, things will get better for the rest of us. Those are the sort of buzzwords and sentiments you have to be very, very careful of, because all of those can lead further down the line from what we're seeing in this document to what eventually happens in Nazi Germany, and once more the sort of catastrophic consequences that that's going to have for the entire world, but also for the people of Germany as well, right? That essentially, because they bought in so heavily to a lot of these ideas, that in the end it destroyed their country, right? It destroyed the nation, tons and tons of death and destruction within Germany itself. And of course, not all the German people believed in this. There were plenty of people who were critical of the Nazi Party. As I mentioned, when Adolf Hitler gains power, the Nazis had never even held a majority in the government. But that's how fascism works, right? Once they get their claws in, it becomes harder and harder for anyone who is critical of this and who doesn't agree with this to speak out, because quite often they're the ones who are going to be targeted first. They're going to be removed from whatever kind of political position or public position they might have, and as a last resort, oftentimes they are going to be the first ones who are targeted. If you look at the very first concentration camps which are created in Germany, they were actually created essentially for political dissidents, for people who did not agree with the Nazi Party and sort of pushed back in some way, shape, or form, that they were essentially sent to these sort of re-education concentration camps in order to essentially just remove them from the scene or the equation. And it was only after the war begins that what had been set up sort of prior to the war for political dissidents was going to eventually be turned into these sort of death camps that they were then going to be targeting Jewish individuals, other non-German citizens, as well as large other sort of groups of people that they found for one reason or another undesirable, and ultimately trying to kill them all, right? So I think that's why you have to be so cautious about how these ideas can start small, but can develop into horrifically catastrophic consequences. All right, so moving on to 2, and some of this we've already talked about in answer 1 and number 2, but we're going to sort of add on to it too a little bit here. So what role did the forces of fascism, social Darwinism, anti-Semitism, and autocracy, or autarky, play in the development of Nazi state and ideology, and what were the Nazi Party's main goals, and how did Hitler want to go about achieving them? And really, to a large degree, you can't really separate the first part of this question from the second part of the question. It's sort of, they are sort of two separate ideas, but I think you sort of have to combine them together in one shape or form. And some people actually did this in their answers, which I was really glad to see. That, you know, these roles were very much also the way that the Nazi and Adolf Hitler in particular wanted to go about trying to solve these problems. So, first and foremost, the main goal, or one of the main goals, was the reversal of the Treaty of Versailles, right? That they wanted to take all of those, what they saw as unfair reparations and so forth, and reverse all those. So the main goals, they wanted to reunify that sort of idea of Greater Germany, right? All those portions and pieces that had been picked off and granted to various countries around them, they wanted all those back into one country. Once again, they wanted to cancel reparations, and they wanted to rearm themselves. Those were certainly some of the main goals of the Nazi Party. All of which, of course, went against the Treaty of Versailles, which they had signed and was supposed to, at this point in time, sort of be enforced by the League of Nations, by France and Great Britain. But we'll talk about in a little minute here why, even though the Nazis start essentially undoing these portions of the Treaty of Versailles, that there's not more pushback. Also, you really see this idea of trying to create a society based on racial purity, right? This sort of trying to ensure the culmination of this idea of the master race, which of course is based on a lot of those ideas and concepts which had developing through the 1800s, right? This idea of scientific racism, these ideas of eugenics, that essentially, just to sort of remind you, sort of social Darwinism was this idea that has absolutely nothing to do with the actual evolutionary ideas of Darwinism, which have only to do, sort of evolution at the species level over oftentimes hundreds of thousands or millions of years. That has absolutely nothing to do with this. This is sort of just taking some basic premises of Darwinism, like competition between species, and saying, well, human beings act the same way. So those human beings who are the most superior sort of have a right to do whatever they want to those people who are less superior. And of course, sort of coming off of that idea, the sort of idea of scientific racism, that there's this sort of racial hierarchy throughout the world, and that some people are just sort of inherently better than others. Of course, all these ideas are just essentially racist ideas that have been disproved up until, through the 20th century and in the 21st century, we know that race in no way, shape, or form works like the way that they thought it did at this point in time. But this idea that eugenics was that sort of through selective breeding and only sort of the people with the purest genes reproducing with other people with the purest genes, you could kind of try to create the sort of superhuman race. And those are all ideas that the Nazi state takes to heart. If you look at their propaganda, it's all focused around sort of these blonde-haired, tall, blue-eyed individuals. This idea of trying to sort of create these perfect people, these perfect soldiers, and so forth is very much in the propaganda that you see being created at this point in time. And of course, that's another reason why you see so many people who are viewed as sort of undesirable, whether it's people who are Jewish individuals. Unfortunately, individuals with mental or physical disabilities are going to be targeted through this process. And that they are going to be either, in some cases, sterilized, in some cases outright killed, so that they cannot reproduce and pass on, which the Germans, or the Nazis, I should say, not necessarily the Germans themselves, but the Nazis characterized as being undesirable traits. These were all ideas of trying to sort of secure this sort of racial superiority for the Nazi Party. And as I said, this is all based on science, which is completely false. And ironically, if you actually look at the science behind it, eugenics makes absolutely no sense from an evolutionary standpoint. One thing we know about evolution is that species which are the most successful at reproducing are the ones that actually have the highest amount of variability and diversity within them, because they are much more able to adapt to changing environments around them. That's one of the key hallmarks of what makes something evolutionary successful. And the entire idea of narrowing down a gene pool to a very small selective part actually makes a species a lot less strong and a lot more likely to be, for example, wiped out by one sickness or one plague or one change in environment. So really, on a scientific level, it's completely, excuse my French, ass backwards of what they were actually trying to accomplish here. But it also is very much one of their sort of main goals of the party, was try to achieve this very fictional idea in their head. And the last main goal that you see driving the Nazi Party is this idea of Lebensraum. Living space is sort of the translation into English for this, living space for the German people. And this is really the idea of expansion and conquest. And this isn't necessarily separated from the last point I talked about. Hitler and the Nazis had this idea that in order for the Germans to sort of replicate and create this master race, that they needed more space to do it. They needed sort of more area for their citizens, for a higher population. Of course, one of the sort of propaganda things they had was trying to encourage people to have lots and lots of kids, that as long as they fell into that sort of narrow casting that they had. And they wanted sort of more territory and land to do this. When we look at the next question about what ultimately drives the very aggressive foreign policy that Hitler has, these are one of the main driving factors, this idea of trying to gain more space for German expansion. Increasingly, the main area that he is looking for to try to do this in is going to be Poland and Eastern Europe. So it's not surprising that that is ultimately going to be the locations that spark the Second World War, is the Nazi invasion of those countries. Just ironically, on a side note here, one of the influences that Hitler actually has with this idea of Lebensraum actually connects to the United States. Hitler actually used the United States treatment of American Indians and sort of the United States conquest of the western portions of the United States as a template and an example of taking people who were perceived as being an inferior people, of taking the land away from them, putting those people into confined areas, and then using that location to enrich a country. He thought that the United States had already gone through this process, and he wanted Nazi Germany to go through a similar process in making themselves into, once more, the sort of great country or great nation. So that's really sort of the how all those come together. Oh, the last autarky is the last element of this, and that sort of ties into the idea of Lebensraum as well. Essentially, the idea that they wanted Nazi Germany to be essentially self-sufficient, that they wouldn't have to rely upon trade or external countries in order to fuel a war or a conflict, to try to make sure that they weren't going to be running into any hindrances in case of a long, drawn-out, prolonged conflict. And of course, Hitler realized that these policies were eventually going to draw a military reaction. Particularly, it had always been his goal to invade the Soviet Union and to have this sort of grand conflict with them. And he wanted to make sure that when war ultimately came, that Germany was going to have all of the resources it needed for this long, prolonged war that he saw coming. And we'll get more into that, as well as how that plays into the foreign policy decisions in our next question here. So moving on to question number 3, describe the aggressive foreign policy of the Axis in the years leading up to World War II. How did the Western powers attempt to deal with the Axis? So once more, the Axis constitutes sort of Nazi Germany, fascist Italy under Mussolini, and sort of the military state of Japan. And how essentially they all agreed to respect each other's conquests. All of them also had that idea and that mind of autocracy in mind, that they were going to have all their sort of resources they needed to conduct the military wars and military expansions that they were going to need. And you definitely sort of see that reflected in their foreign policies and activities throughout this time period. And one of the biggest of those is that idea of expansion, right? You see all three of these countries trying to expand in very imperialistic kind of ways, similar to how we saw sort of imperialism leading up to the First World War. We see sort of this new wave of imperialism here by these Axis countries in the lead up to the Second World War. So you see Italy active in North Africa, for example, trying to expand their reigns on the continent of Africa. Of course, one of Mussolini's big promises is to try to sort of rebuild the Roman Empire, right? So try to once more take control of all of the Mediterranean and be sort of the main power base around there. Of course, the idea of Lebensraum of Germany looking very heavily at Eastern Europe, as well as reconstituting those territories they had lost in the First World War. And of course, you see Japan increasing their efforts in their wars with China and trying to expand farther into Southeast Asia as well. Of course, Japan very much trying to take advantage of sort of the chaos of the First World War and the decrease in European imperialism to essentially create their own version of imperialism and try to be the primary military power in the Pacific region. So you definitely see a push or outright expansionist policies in all three of them. Particularly, the build-up to the Second World War is very much focused around Germany and their sort of very aggressive foreign policy, once more designed at regressing what they had seen as those grievances from the First World War, as well as that idea of trying to achieve that idea of Lebensraum that Adolf Hitler was so obsessed with. So, for example, you see the annexation of Austria being sort of a diplomatic crisis which occurs, where there was a Nazi party faction in Austria. Once more, it was not as strong sort of as other factions in there, but they try to essentially create a coup, which was backed up eventually by Germany, and it meant that essentially Austria was going to be run by a Nazi party, very similar and oftentimes sort of under the guise of the Nazi party in Germany. You see the Czechoslovakia crisis being a perfect example of that idea of trying to reconstitute Germany, particularly those areas in the land known as the Sudetenland that was given to Czechoslovakia at the end of the First World War. Germany almost goes to war with Czechoslovakia. In fact, Hitler really wanted a war of Czechoslovakia in the build-up to this. Hitler and the Nazis had already thrown off a lot of the Treaty of Versailles. They had already been rearming by the time you get to this point, and in certain cases it seemed like Hitler was really itching for a fight. He really wanted to go to war of Czechoslovakia, and he sort of seemed like he had been outmaneuvered or outplayed when France and Great Britain ultimately come in and create a diplomatic solution to the crisis. Now, the diplomatic solution was to essentially give Adolf Hitler everything he was demanding, particularly that the Sudetenland was taken away from Czechoslovakia and just outright given to Germany without a war being fought or a shot being fired, but that still left Adolf Hitler feeling like he had been robbed of what he thought should have been sort of a warm-up fight, if you want to think of it in that kind of a concept towards what he had been hoping to, in the future, launch against other countries, and in particular against the Soviet Union. And that ultimately leads to his decision to invade Poland. Getting back to the idea that Hitler had always been bent on war, that's very true. He still, by 1939, though, wanted to wait about 5 to 10 more years until he thought that Germany was really going to be ready for the big war, if you want to think of it in that way. But he wanted to, once more, like I said, have these sort of warm-up fights against smaller countries around them that he did not believe was going to spark a larger military conflict, particularly after the lengths that France and Great Britain went to in the Czechoslovakian crisis. He had convinced himself that if he invaded Poland, that there was going to be no military response from France and Great Britain. And of course, before he invades Poland, he does sort of what a lot of people thought was the least likely thing, and very surprising. He signs that non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, sort of a secret deal which essentially carved up Poland, saying, okay, Soviet Union, we know, and Stalin, we know that you really want the eastern half of our of Poland. We want the western half of Poland. Let's just go halvesies on it. And poor Poland essentially is kind of stuck in the middle of this. So once more, very surprising that Hitler and the Nazis would actually make a deal like that with the Soviet Union, but it was always with that idea that he had that in another 5 to 10 years he was going to be launching this massive war against the Soviet Union, so it didn't really matter if he gave him half of Poland, for a few years anyways, because he was planning on coming in and conquering it to begin with. And really it's with the invasion of Poland that the League of Nations collapses, and that Britain and France realized that the diplomacy that they had been using, which the book did a really good job of sort of that debate around the idea of appeasement, right? Oftentimes this idea of continually using these crises, whether it was the Abyssinian War with Italy, whether it was the Spanish Civil War, whether it was the Czechoslovakian crisis, or the annexation of Austria. Essentially, the main goal of France and Great Britain was to avoid another large European-wide war. If you want to think of it like this, they essentially had learned the lessons of the First World War, and that was to try to avoid wars like the First World War. They didn't want another large fight, and that's one of the reasons why they really sort of bent over backwards in order to try to make sure that there wasn't going to be another large military conflict with Germany, that both of those countries had suffered through the Great Depression, both of those had suffered immensely in the First World War, and really had no desire or no stomach for another large fight. So if you look at the ground that they gave to Hitler in the Czechoslovakian crisis, that was all essentially their desperate attempts to try to avoid another European-wide war. With the invasion of Poland, essentially it became clear that that tactic was a failure. It was no longer going to work, and that's one of the reasons why appeasement has been seen as such a failure up until this point in time. The book, once more, did a really good job of explaining why that's a little bit of an oversimplification, that there were very legitimate reasons why France and Great Britain did not want to start another war, that they were not in a good economic or military position to do so, and that they felt like they were acting in their own best self-interest by trying to avoid another large-scale conflict like World War I. Like I said, they'd essentially felt like they had learned the proper lessons from the First World War, which to just not get engaged in those kind of military conflicts. I would say the one big shortfalling of appeasement, and the book sort of alludes to as much, was this idea of they really misunderstood Hitler's main goals and ambitions. They didn't realize that his ultimate goals were this sort of incredibly aggressive expansion. This idea of Lebensraum was really his driving force, even though it was in a lot of his propaganda, and they could have looked at that. There was always this idea that he was kind of a rational political actor, and of course all rational people should want to avoid another large-scale military conflict. They didn't realize that he was essentially itching for another fight. Unfortunately, it took the invasion of Poland for really that lesson to come crashing home on France and on Great Britain, which is why that is what is eventually going to be prompting them to declare war on Nazi Germany. Of course, quickly after that, Nazi Germany and Italy signed that kind of pact of steel, which is going to ferment their alliance. Eventually, Japan is going to be brought into this as well, and you have sort of the sides being drawn for the Second World War. And of course, we'll talk about in a moment here the expansion of the war and why eventually the Soviet Union and the United States are going to be brought in as well. But that essentially is the buildup that you see from these sort of fascist and militarist governments, and the response from these more sort of democratic governments in the buildup to the Second World War. All right, so describe the early years of the Second World War. And how and why were the Axis able to achieve early victories? Of course, early on in the war, things seemed to go very well for Nazi Germany, for Fascist Italy, for Japan. And this is for a couple of reasons. Essentially, as I mentioned, France and Great Britain, in my opinion at least, learned the correct lesson from the First World War politically, that being these large wars ultimately are bad for everyone, and that Germany did not learn the correct lesson, that this kind of hyper-nationalism ultimately leads to these large wars, which are not good for everyone. But militarily, Nazi Germany is a country that sort of learned, I would say, the proper lessons from World War I, and very much tried to create military strategies to avoid getting bogged down in another stalemate, right? The fact that the military technology of the First World War outpaced the tactics of the First World War is really what led to that stalemate. That the machine gun gave such a defensive advantage that both sides just sort of ground to a halt. Germany's main goal in the Second World War was to try to avoid getting bogged down in those long, drawn-out military conflicts, and that ultimately leads to this idea that is eventually going to be termed blitzkrieg, sometimes referred to as lightning warfare is the translation. And it was once more using technology, primarily in the form of fast-moving armored vehicles, so tanks, motor cars, armored trucks, and combining that then with air power. So a lot of communication going on between fast-moving ground units and fast-moving air units, with the idea being that if you can break through defensive formations very quickly, circle behind those defensive formations and hit defensive formations from the air in coordination, that you can surround these defenses before both sides can get entrenched. And this ultimately proves very successful for Germany in the early portions of the Second World War. That's why they are able to defeat Poland so quickly. It's also why they are able to very quickly move into the Low Countries, into the Netherlands, and into Belgium, and sweep into the French and British lines, and ultimately gives them a real military advantage. Looking at the lessons that were not necessarily learned so well from the First World War, France had really sort of doubled down on that idea of trench warfare. They created this huge defensive formation along their border of Germany known as the Maginot Line, which was sort of the trench of all trenches, if you want to think about that. All sorts of concrete bunkers and underground passages connecting all these various defensive formations, which may have in fact proven somewhat effective against the Germans. The problem with the Maginot Line is because the Great Depression hit, the French didn't have enough money to complete it. So essentially, this ultimate defensive fortification, this ultimate trench, stops about at the exact same location that the Germans took in the first round of fighting in the First World War, pretty much ended at the Belgian border. So the Germans essentially just take the exact same route into France that they had taken in the First World War and completely bypassed all of the military preparations, defensively at least, that the French had set up along the Maginot Line. So a large percentage of their sort of defensive infrastructure wasn't used whatsoever in the Second World War. Had they had time to complete the line, which was supposed to extend all the way to the North Sea, perhaps it would have been more effective. Certainly, the British and the French realized this, and that's one of the reasons why they sent so many of their forces into the Low Countries. The problem is that they were not as coordinated as the Germans. The Germans were able to use that idea of blitzkrieg to very quickly break through the British and the French lines and encircle large pockets of those armies and quickly defeat them. This, of course, is where you have those stories of the majority of the British army, as well as portions of the French army, are essentially forced into a pocket around the city of Dunkirk. There's this huge, heroic sort of naval maneuver, as well as civilian vessels being involved to extract all those forces back over to Great Britain. There was a movie that came out a few years ago called Dunkirk that actually essentially goes through this battle if you want to see more of a visualized depiction of it. But very important that at least a lot of those forces were able to be retreated and were able to fight again another day. But that was sort of the only bright spot, in which was a very bleak period for the Allies. Essentially, France is forced to surrender within a matter of weeks, which really no one saw coming, that it was going to be that sort of lopsided in this military conflict. And France, essentially at that point in time, is taken out of the military conflict. The northern part of France is pretty much taken over by the Germans and run directly by them. The southern portion is sort of this puppet government, which is set up, known as the Vichy regime. And that it seems very quickly there like Hitler was essentially accomplishing all of his goals, that there was no other power in continental Europe except for the Soviet Union, who essentially they had a non-aggression pact with, who could potentially challenge them. Italy, of course, decides to go on their own expeditions, and Italy is much less successful militarily in their expansion into the Mediterranean and into North Africa than the Germans are. In fact, Italy almost loses North Africa, and Germany has to sort of come down and bail them out. And that Italy just did not have sort of the military means to back up the aspirations in the same way that that Nazi Germany did. Ironically, a lot of the success that Germany experiences early here in the war comes back in a lot of ways to bite them. Hitler himself took a very personal role in commanding these battles, and he was always pushing his armies to be more aggressive, and more aggressive than a lot of his generals wanted to. But because they had experienced this level of success, it was very hard to say no to him, or pretty much outright impossible to say no to him in future conflicts. And when he ultimately comes up with some really bad military ideas and really bad military strategies, no one's in a position to tell him no, and that ultimately is going to very much be hurting the Nazi war effort as time goes on. So it's kind of ironic that these early military successes ultimately end up making things worse for the Nazis as the war lengthens and goes on. You also see an increase in Japanese expansion during this time period. As they felt like because Great Britain, which had been sort of the most powerful imperial country in the world, was now sort of the only country facing Germany, that there was not going to be a lot of resistance to Japanese expansion. And ultimately that means that Japan is able to look at the Soviet Union and the United States as their two main rivals and their two main obstacles to what they wanted to achieve in the Pacific. So finally, at the end of this time period, really you see Britain standing alone against Nazi Germany. The one advantage that Great Britain has, of course, is that they are on an island, and that this incredibly effective sort of ground forces and ground army that Nazi Germany had was not able to get to them. If they wanted to get to Great Britain, they'd have to have some sort of nautical invasion. The problem, of course, being that essentially Great Britain still had the leg up, as they pretty much always have in these large wars and military conflicts, in the Navy. And that if any kind of amphibious assault was going to be possible on Great Britain, it was going to have to be because Germany was going to have air superiority. They needed to win the air war so that they could essentially win the sea war, so that they could then launch an amphibious invasion. So the Battle of Britain ultimately is going to come down to essentially being purely an air war between the Nazi Luftwaffe and the RAF, the Royal Air Force of Great Britain. The Nazis come close to being able to knock out the British ability to fight back. They take out a number of airfields, they bomb a number of civilian locations within Great Britain, but the British are able to take advantage of a couple of advantages. First of all, they are fighting on home turf and home soil, so that if an airplane is shot down, they are able to sort of grab the pilot and put the pilot into a new airplane and send them back up, whereas a German pilot gets shot down, they're going to be going to a prisoner of war camp. And ultimately, what ends up winning the battle for the British is that the Nazis start running low on pilots, not even planes. The fact that the training that went into being a pilot was so intensive that it was a relatively small group of individuals that, throughout this process, too many of them get shot down, too many of them are captured or killed, and that Adolf Hitler essentially has to call off the idea of an amphibious invasion of Great Britain. And that really leads us into our next point here, this formation of the Grand Alliance and how the Grand Alliance is ultimately able to secure victory. So first of all, at this point in time, you have to get to how does the Great Alliance even form, because of the Grand Alliance, particularly being Great Britain, the United States, and Soviet Russia, two of them are not currently in the conflict. So how this starts to change and what leads to the Grand Alliance, first of all, is the United States and Russia being brought into the conflict. I just talked about how Hitler would be unable to essentially launch an amphibious assault, at least in the short term, on Great Britain, and this sort of put him in a bind because he now had this large army that at this point in time had essentially been undefeated, that was ready to keep going, but that it was on sort of a time limit, that they needed resources in order to keep the war effort going, and that if the war just drug on, eventually they were going to be running out of these resources. So he had a large, very resource-intensive army in the field, and no one to fight. And this is ultimately what leads him to what I would say is ultimately the biggest turning point in all the Second World War. The Nazi and Adolf Hitler's decision to attack the Soviet Union, so-called Operation Barbarossa, which he launches the following year. And this is really like I said, the turning point of the conflict, because it broadens the conflict to a whole another level with the introduction of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was actually more than willing to go halvesies on Poland. They eventually end up attacking Finland and start trying to do sort of their own expansions. But to the large part, Stalin seems to have taken Hitler at his word that this sort of mutual defense pact, or non-aggression pact, I should say, it wasn't a mutual defense pact, it was a non-aggression pact, this was going to be holding, and that he wasn't going to have to worry about Nazi Germany. So that when Germany ultimately launches what is at this point in time the largest sort of ground assault in history, Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Union is caught very flat-footed and very much by surprise. And that, of course, is what's going to bring the Soviet Union into the conflict. Very similarly, it's going to take an attack to bring the United States into the conflict. That prior to this, even though sentiment had very much tipped on the side of the Allies against Nazi Germany, there were still very strong isolationist pockets within the United States. People who said, we're still recovering from the Great Depression, there's no reason we should be involved in another large European type war, and that really was more in line, I would say, traditionally with U.S. foreign policy than being an interventionist. And that's why for the first couple of years, essentially the United States, even though they start supplying the Allied forces with guns and ammunition and so forth, and they begin preparing for a potential war, because they certainly did see, and Roosevelt certainly saw, the threat posed by Adolf Hitler, that they did not actually become militarily engaged or involved. And ultimately, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the Japanese expansion and their decision to enter into the Second World War and to launch their attack on Pearl Harbor. And essentially, it was a miscalculation on their part, that they once more viewed the United States as being their primary barrier to expansion in the region. They saw that the United States was helping out China, their enemy that they were trying to expand into, and that sort of the United States fleet in the Pacific was sort of, the big thing keeping them from being able to expand more widely in the Pacific. But also, I'd say even more than all that, economically, they felt that the United States, through embargoes and so forth, had stopped trading them essential war materials, which, of course, was essentially what the United States was trying to do. And just like Germany, feeling that they did not have the resources to conduct a large on-scale war, the Japanese essentially felt the same way, and that they needed the resources that the United States was trading them in order to continue their military expansion. So the attack on Pearl Harbor was really an attempt by the Japanese to try to force the Americans back into trading with them. Of course, this was a miscalculation because that in no way, shape, or form is the result that they got. Attacking Pearl Harbor didn't make the United States start trading again with Japan, and of course brought them into the Second World War. So now you have Russia and the United States entered into the war, and they then team up with Great Britain to form this idea of the Grand Alliance, sometimes called the Allies, to fight back against the Axis power, against Germany, Italy, and Japan. So the battle lines have now been drawn. So why was the Grand Alliance ultimately able to secure victory? And I'll go into more of the particulars in a moment here, but on a broad level, it is really this idea of resources that once more, Germany and Nazi Germany and Hitler did not learn the lessons of the First World War, that they once more found themselves in the exact same position that they had been, that they were fighting a larger, more industrialized, and wealthier and higher population opponents, and they were fighting a two-front war once again, which had all been their downfalls in the First World War, and now they found themselves in the exact same position, particularly because of that idea of resources, where Japan and Nazi Germany were running low on resources. They felt like they needed to achieve these military victories in order to get more resources to continue to fuel this military conquest that they were launching, while the Allies essentially already had those resources. The Soviet Union already had a lot of those natural resources and oil and so forth that Germany was desperately seeking. The United States already had a lot of those resources that Japan was mad that they had stopped trading to them. And they were able to use those resources to fuel their own war efforts that made them incredibly strong opponents. So once more, I mentioned that the invasion of Russia was really a mistake on the part of Adolf Hitler and the Germany. And this is really sort of the beginning of the end for them in a lot of ways, because they ultimately, once more, just like in France, have very early success. They blitz over most of eastern Russia. They encircle and destroy large portions of the Red Army. Ultimately, they get very close. They get within sight, actually, of Moscow and St. Petersburg. Towards late October, early November. And really, Russia is only solved by one of its main advantages that it always has when it's fighting on its soil, its winters. Because first, you have these huge torrential downpours, which sort of stop the Nazi advance in the mud, and very quickly it freezes and turns to snow, and a very, very bitter winter in 1941. And the Nazi advance is just frozen in place, and they are not able to sort of gain those big sort of political victories of getting those large cities like Moscow and like St. Petersburg, and ultimately are able and forced to retreat. On top of this, you have the fact, and this is once more where I'm saying that Hitler's early success comes back to bite him, because he was so confident in his army that when he sends them into battle, he forbids them to bring winter uniforms and winter materials along with them, because he thought it would slow them down too much, and they wanted this quick military victory. Of course, now that winter has set in, it means that his troops are very much undersupplied, and because they had expanded so rapidly and so quickly, that their supply lines were left way in the dust. So these armies are essentially left out on their own in the elements, facing counterattacks from the Soviet Union without being properly prepared for winter warfare, and they really take very heavy casualties, of the hundreds and thousands actually, and are forced to retreat away from these large gains that they had almost achieved and almost won. So that's one big turning point. The next turning point comes the next year in 1942. Where once more the Nazi forces try to redouble their attack. They this time are going primarily through desperation to try to get to the oil fields in sort of southern Russia. So they're trying to get into the Caucasus Mountain region. But in their way is a river that they have to try to get across, the Volga River, and also on this river is a couple of large cities, one of which is Stalingrad, which is one of the largest industrial centers of the Soviet Union. And just like the year before, the Nazi armies early on have success. They're able to encircle some of the Russian armies. They're able to push some of the advances that the Soviets had made during the previous year, during the previous winter. eradicate those. But once more they get bogged down, this time in the city of Stalingrad itself, as it comes down to essentially sort of urban warfare, as both armies just keep throwing more and more forces into the city, and the Nazis, once more, when their biggest advantage, kind of that mobility and speed of their armies, are taken away from them, are unable to break through the Soviet forces. So they get strung up into Stalingrad. Essentially, an entire army is going to be defeated there. The battle drags on until the winter sets in, and at that point in time, the army gets surrounded by numerous Russian armies, and the entire Fourth German Army is almost completely destroyed. And from that point in time, really, even before the United States and Great Britain opened a second front in D-Day, the writing's almost on the wall. It was going to be nearly impossible for the Nazis to be victorious in the war. Of course, it was still very helpful for the Soviet Union that the Nazis had to defend against an amphibious invasion from the United States and Great Britain. And certainly if they had had those troops, who knows what would have happened. But because, once more, the Nazi forces have to be split on two fronts, that's the farthest advance they ever make into Russia. And from that time period moving forward, it is a slow decline as the Soviet Union continually pushes the Nazi army back towards the German border. In the Pacific, there's a sort of couple of main battles that sort of turn the tide very early after the Battle of Pearl Harbor in the favor of the United States. The first of those is the Battle of the Coral Sea, which was a naval engagement between a Japanese fleet and a U.S. fleet. And even though the battle itself was inconclusive, the most important element of it is that a number of the Japanese carriers actually get damaged and can't participate in the next battle, which ultimately becomes the most important battle, the Battle of Midway. Because at the Battle of Midway, because the Japanese were essentially short-handed due to the Battle of the Coral Sea, the United States are able to sink a number of the Japanese carriers. And ultimately, what sort of turns the tide and determines the victory in the war is going to be the side that has the most aircraft carriers, as they're able to get air advantage and air superiority around the various islands and island chains that a lot of the fighting is going to be taking place in. And once more, from that period moving forward, it's sort of a slow march back towards Japanese territory on the part of the United States. And finally, the last turning point, of course, is D-Day and the invasion of Normandy and the opening up of a large second front on the European continent, as the British, the Americans, and some of their other allies who had been fighting by their side ultimately are able to essentially pull off the largest naval amphibious invasion in history, very successfully open up another front. Certainly wasn't without sacrifice and without trial, but by that time period, or after that occurs, it's only a matter of time before Germany is going to be defeated. So what ultimately ends up happening with the Grand Alliance? What causes the breakdown? And really, the breakdown of the Grand Alliance, particularly the Soviet Union sort of breaking off from the United States and Great Britain, or vice versa, had been seeded during the fighting itself. The Soviet Union felt in the fighting that even though it was really common enemies which brought these countries together in the first place, the Soviet Union really felt that there was still a lot of hostility on the part of the United States and Great Britain towards the Soviet Union. And this would have been nothing new. Britain and the United States had always been very critical of the Soviet Union. They had backed the Tsarist armies in the last days of the First World War, and very much both their governments were very hostile to communism. So the Soviet Union perceived that the British and the Americans were not necessarily doing their the fastest work, shall we say, to open up a second front, and were sort of trying to make sure that the majority of the casualties were going to be falling on the side of the Soviet Union. Even when a second front is opened up, it sort of becomes a race into German territory, because both sides start becoming very distrustful of the other. United States and Britain want to make sure that they can get as much territory under their control as they can. Soviet Union is saying the same thing, because no one really knows how the post-war period is going to play out. And if you think of the old adage that possession is 9/10 of the law, that's sort of the premise that they were operating under. They sort of felt that if whatever we can take over, we are going to have a say on how that area is going to be reconstructed following the war. Really, it's going to be that mistrust between the Soviet Union and the United States, which is going to lead to the United States to try to end the war in the Pacific with Japan earlier, because they don't want the Soviet Union to make any more gains in the Pacific. That's going to be one of the factors that the United States is going to use in determining that they want to drop the atomic bombs, was essentially feeling pressured that the Soviet Union was going to be taking over more territory in Korea, in Manchuria, in northern China, and so forth, and they did not want that to happen, particularly because of mistrust between them. So really, the fact that the only thing that brought the Grand Alliance together in the first place was a common enemy. Once that common enemy was no longer there, you very quickly see the alliance fall apart, and very quickly you start seeing the seeds being planted for the Cold War, which we're going to be getting into and talking a lot more about next week. So our final question looks at the idea of total war, because more than any other war or any other conflict really in the 20th century, or quite honestly in human history, World War II is defined by total war. How was it utilized during the Second World War, and to what degree was it starting a loss of life in the conflict due to total war? So essentially, total war is a nation or a country using all of their human and material resources and putting it all into a war effort. That essentially all the citizenry is supposed to be doing something to benefit a war effort. They're supposed to be sacrificing their own needs to the state, to the army. If you want to think about, the example of this would be, for example, women going to work in munition factories because so many men are out fighting in the war, or people rationing things like butter or sugar during the war. They're not having enough of their own because they're trying to benefit the war effort. To more extreme end of it, you could look at entire industries being redesigned to stop producing vacuum cleaners or toasters or anything else, and starting to crank out tanks and war supplies and war materials, where all the country's economy, population, and so forth is completely driven towards winning a war and supporting a war effort. That's what total war is. But it's more than that. It also is the consequence of what that is. And you saw this a little bit in the First World War, and you started seeing really examples of this with some of those nationalist wars of the 1800s, for example, the Civil War or the Crimean War. And that is that there starts to be a blurring of lines between what constitutes military force and what constitutes civilians, or military targets or civilian targets, because armies are so large now, and because the only way to support those large of armies is to completely re-engineer and design a society and a people and a culture and an economy to support a war effort, that increasingly civilian targets are going to be justified by all sides in the conflict in the Second World War, with essentially the idea being if you can take out or demoralize or do enough damage to a civilian population, that it's going to hinder, harm, and hurt its that country's or that nation's war-making capabilities. And essentially, all the combatants in World War II, to some degree or another, agreed to that premise. All of them end up targeting civilian targets throughout this process with that idea or goal in mind. And really, it's that which leads to the staggering loss of life in the conflict. It's all tied back to this idea of total war. First of all, it's this idea of these massive armies. Just more people were able to be participating and fighting in this conflict than in any previous war, so of course there's going to be higher casualties. Combine that with the new increased technology, the more lethal bombs, larger bombs, more accurate weapons and rifles, tanks, you name it. All of this is just going to lead to higher and higher casualty rates of those people who are fighting. Add on top of this the fact that there was really extreme hatred built up by, in a lot of cases, these ideas of nationalism that had been brewing, for almost a century at this point in time between these countries. How so much of the Nazis' ideology was based around that hyper-nationalism. A lot of the Soviet ideology was based around that as well. And that's going to combine to lead to more atrocities, how there's going to be deliberate targeting of civilians through pure hatred, once more, on a lot of sides. If you look at the armies and the soldiers themselves, the Soviets particularly, and the Nazis, where there was really this hatred built up between the two, you see all sorts of war crimes being committed. For example, out of those nearly 400,000 German soldiers who get taken prisoner at the end of the Stalingrad, it's somewhere in the vicinity of like a couple thousand end up ever making their way back to Germany. The rest, either through execution or being put into labor camps or one reason or another, end up dying before they can ever make it back. So it was very much not uncommon for captured prisoners to not be in fact captured, to just be outright killed, and for there to be all sorts of human rights abuses in conquered areas by one faction or one army or the other. Also, just the targeting of industrial centers, which were primarily being worked by civilians, is factored into this and is very much a part of this as well. And that targeting of civilians is certainly going to bring up the level of casualties and the loss of life which the Second World War saw. And this oftentimes was very, very deliberate. If you think about the Holocaust, for example, the Holocaust, you might seem like it is separated from the idea of total war because it was this idea of sort of this ethnic cleansing that the Nazis were trying to do. But the primary, reason and driving factor behind this hatred towards Jewish individuals and the Jewish people was once more this false and manufactured idea that they had sabotaged the previous war effort in the First World War, and that Hitler is trying to make sure essentially that not just the sort of idea of racial purity, but also to make sure that there's no chance that there could be any internal sabotage of the war effort, is all going to lead in this decision, what he ultimately calls his final decision, right? This idea to try to exterminate the entire Jewish race. So it's very much tied into this idea of total war and becomes, really one of the darkest chapters in human history. If you want to look at the decision to use the atomic weapons as well in Japan, the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, also very much driven by this idea of total war, that if you can target and harm a civilian population hard enough that it's going to force the other side to surrender. Essentially, it was the same mentality behind the Nazis trying to bomb London in the Battle of Britain. Of course, the Nazis were unsuccessful in this, and probably a good portion of that is because they couldn't deal enough damage with their conventional bombs that they were using to try to sort of shell shock the British into surrender. The fact that the United States had developed this new devastating technology, and the fact that they were able and that they were willing to deploy it to eliminate and decimate hundreds of thousands of people in one shot, really just completely traumatized the Japanese. Of course, this was already at the point where they felt that the war was very much not going in their favor, but that the United States justified essentially killing average, everyday Japanese people who, were not combatants, because of this idea of total war, that they were essentially the ones fueling the war effort, and that if you target them, you could essentially bring a faster end to the war, which is what the United States desired, once more because they were mistrustful of the Soviet Union. So, really, I would say the decision to drop those atomic weapons was just as much a political decision as it was a military decision, both of which I think you have heard criticism of over the years, and I think is rightly so. It's very hard to tell how many extra lives, potentially American U.S. soldiers' lives, it would have cost had there been an outright invasion of land. It's also impossible to know how much more territory the Soviet Union might have been able to gain by that point in time. But just in fact that those sort of calculations are being weighed against hundreds of thousands and millions of people's lives, it's very troubling and very disturbing, and I would say, regardless of what perspective or angle you're looking at, it is definitely one of the darkest legacies that come out of the Second World War. Essentially, how willing all sides were to sacrifice people's lives in order to benefit their own war cause. Of course, history is all about trying to learn lessons, and hopefully through this class period this week, you have had a chance in order to do that, because we did tackle some pretty big, heavy issues, and I thought you had some fantastic responses to a lot of these and put a lot of good thought into them. And really, if you want to learn lessons of history, you can't learn lessons if you don't admit at making any mistakes. And I think we can all look at the Second World War and say there are lots of things about this time period and the build up to it and the rise of Nazi Germany and everything. There's lots of things here that we don't want to repeat. And that's why I think it's more important than ever to be looking at them and studying them. Thank you all very much and have a fantastic week. I'll be back with another review video probably close to next weekend. Thank you.